If you're enjoying this story from the Old West, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more tales of courage, redemption, and the untamed frontier. Your support helps us bring these forgotten stories to life. The autumn wind carried the scent of dying leaves and wood smoke through the narrow streets of Cedar Ridge, a small frontier town nestled between rolling hills and endless prairie. Dr. Samuel Morrison pulled his black coat tighter as he walked toward his modest clinic, the wooden sign creaking above the door in the crisp October breeze. Samuel had been the town's only physician for nearly 8 years, ever since he'd arrived with his young wife Margaret, both full of dreams about healing the sick and building a life together on the frontier. Those dreams had shattered 2 winters ago when Margaret died, giving birth to their stillborn son during a blizzard. The clinic bell chimed as Samuel pushed open the door, stepping into the familiar warmth of his practice. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the golden rays. The smell of carbolic acid and dried herbs filled the air, mixing with the faint aroma of coffee from the pot he kept brewing. Mrs. Henderson, the town's seamstress, waited in the wooden chair by his desk, her weathered hands clutching a small bundle. Her grey hair was pulled back severely, and her pale blue eyes held an expression Samuel had seen too many times, the look of someone carrying a burden too heavy for one person to bear alone. "Dr. Morrison," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I've brought someone who needs your help." She gestured toward the bundle in her arms, and Samuel realized it wasn't fabric or sewing supplies. It was a young woman, unconscious and clearly with child, wrapped in a thin blanket. The girl appeared to be no more than 16, her auburn hair matted with dirt and sweat. Her face was gaunt, with hollow cheeks that spoke of weeks without proper food. Dark circles ringed her closed eyes, and her breathing was shallow and labored. Samuel's medical instincts immediately took over. "Put her on the examination table," he instructed, clearing away instruments and supplies. As Mrs. Henderson carefully laid the girl down, Samuel noticed the bruises on her arms and the way her clothes hung loose on her thin frame. "What happened to her?" Mrs. Henderson's mouth tightened into a thin line. "Her mother brought her to town yesterday, trying to sell her to anyone who'd pay. Said she couldn't afford another mouth to feed, especially not with a baby coming." The older woman's voice cracked with emotion. "I couldn't let that happen, Doctor." Samuel felt a familiar anger rise in his chest, the same fury he'd felt countless times when confronted with cruelty and neglect. He'd seen too much suffering in his years on the frontier, too many people abandoned by those who should have protected them. But he pushed the emotion down, focusing on his patient. He began his examination, checking her pulse and breathing, gently pressing his hands against her swollen belly. The baby was active, a good sign, but the mother was severely malnourished and dehydrated. Her skin was pale and clammy, and her body temperature was dangerously low. "She needs immediate care," Samuel said, reaching for his medical bag. "Warm blankets, hot broth, and constant monitoring. The baby seems healthy, but she's been through an ordeal that could have killed them both." He paused, looking at Mrs. Henderson. "What's her name?" "Mary. Mary Sullivan. She's been on the road for weeks," her mother said. "Came from somewhere up north, maybe Kansas." Mrs. Henderson shook her head sadly. "That woman, her own mother, spoke about her like she was livestock. Said Mary was strong enough to work and young enough to bear many children." Samuel's hand stilled on his stethoscope. The callousness of some people never ceased to amaze him, even after all these years. He'd delivered dozens of babies, held dying patients' hands, and seen the full spectrum of human nature. But a mother selling her pregnant daughter still shocked him to his core. As he prepared a warm compress for Mary's forehead, memories of Margaret flooded back. She would have been outraged by this situation, would have insisted they take the girl in without question. Margaret had always seen the good in people, had believed that everyone deserved a second chance at happiness. Mary's eyes fluttered open, revealing deep green irises filled with confusion and fear. She tried to sit up, but Samuel gently pressed her back down. "Easy now," he said softly. "You're safe. You're in my clinic in Cedar Ridge. I'm Dr. Morrison, and this is Mrs. Henderson. No one's going to hurt you here." The girl's eyes darted between Samuel and Mrs. Henderson like a cornered animal searching for escape routes. Her hand instinctively moved to her belly, protecting the life growing within. Where's my mother?" she whispered, her voice hoarse from dehydration. Mrs. Henderson stepped forward, her expression gentle but firm. "She's gone, dear. Left town this morning with the money she got from—" She paused, unable to finish the sentence. "But you don't need to worry about that anymore. We're going to take care of you." Tears began to stream down Mary's face as the full realization of her situation hit her. She'd been abandoned by the one person who should have protected her, sold like property to strangers in a town she'd never seen before. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs. Samuel felt his heart breaking for this young woman. In her frightened eyes, he saw echoes of every patient he'd been unable to save, every person who'd suffered needlessly. But he also saw something else, a strength that reminded him of Margaret, a determination to survive despite impossible circumstances. "Mary," he said gently, "I want you to know that you have choices here. Mrs. Henderson has offered to help, and He paused, surprised by his own words. "I have a house with extra rooms. If you're willing, you can stay there until the baby comes. No conditions, no expectations, just safety and care." The offer surprised even Samuel himself. He'd been living alone since Margaret's death, finding solace in his work and the routine of his solitary life. But looking at Mary's vulnerable state, he knew Margaret would have expected nothing less from him. This was what she would have wanted, to help someone in need. Mary's eyes widened in disbelief. You'd do that? For me? Even though you don't know me?" Her voice was filled with wonder, as if kindness from strangers was something she'd never experienced before. "What if I can't pay you back? What if something goes wrong?" Samuel smiled, the first genuine smile he'd felt in months. "Payment isn't necessary. As for things going wrong, well, that's what doctors are for. I've delivered more babies than I can count, and I've yet to meet a problem that can't be solved with patience and proper care." Over the following days, Mary slowly began to recover under Samuel's careful attention. He moved her to the spare bedroom in his house, a cozy space with yellow curtains that Margaret had sewn, and a rocking chair positioned near the window. The room received morning sunlight and had a view of the small garden Margaret had planted. Mary was quiet at first, speaking only when spoken to and moving through the house like a ghost. She seemed constantly surprised by simple acts of kindness, a warm meal, clean clothes, or just the basic respect of being asked her preferences. Samuel realized she'd probably never experienced unconditional care before. Gradually, as her physical strength returned, Mary began to open up. She told Samuel about her father, who died in a mining accident when she was 12, leaving her mother to raise 5 children alone. She spoke of hunger, of moving from town to town looking for work, of the shame her pregnancy had brought upon her family. "I loved him," she said one evening as they sat by the fireplace. "The baby's father. He was a traveling merchant, promised to take me away from all the hardship. But when I told him about the baby—" Her voice trailed off, and she stared into the dancing flames. "He left town that same night." Samuel listened without judgment, recognizing the pain in her voice. He'd seen this story too many times. Young women seduced by promises of a better life, then abandoned when reality set in. The frontier was full of broken promises and shattered dreams, but it was also a place where people could start over. As winter approached, Mary's belly grew rounder, and her presence began to transform Samuel's lonely house into something resembling a home again. She insisted on helping with cooking and cleaning, despite his protests. Her laughter gradually returned, filling rooms that had been silent for too long. Samuel found himself looking forward to coming home each evening, to sharing meals and conversation with someone who appreciated his company. Mary had a quick wit and an insatiable curiosity about medicine, often asking him to explain his treatments and procedures. She reminded him why he'd become a doctor in the first place. One snowy December evening, as they sat reading by the fire, Mary suddenly gasped and clutched her belly. "Doctor," she whispered, her face pale with pain, I think it's time." Her water had broken, soaking through her dress and the chair beneath her. Samuel's medical training took over, pushing aside any personal anxiety. He'd delivered dozens of babies, but this one felt different, more personal. He helped Mary to the bedroom, gathering his supplies and lighting additional lamps to provide adequate light for the delivery. The labor was long and difficult. Mary was still recovering from months of malnutrition, and her small frame made the delivery challenging. Samuel worked through the night, monitoring her progress and offering encouragement. Mrs. Henderson arrived before dawn, having been alerted by Samuel's hastily sent message. As the first rays of sunlight crept through the bedroom window, Mary gave a final, tremendous push. The baby emerged with a loud cry, tiny fists waving in protest at being thrust into the cold world. Samuel cleaned the infant carefully, checking for any problems, then wrapped the baby in a soft blanket Margaret had embroidered years before. "It's a girl," he said, his voice thick with emotion as he placed the baby in Mary's arms. The newborn had her mother's auburn hair and seemed perfectly healthy despite the circumstances of her birth. Mary looked down at her daughter with wonder, tears streaming down her exhausted face. "She's beautiful," Mary whispered, her finger tracing the baby's tiny cheek. "Thank you, Doctor, for everything. I don't know what would have happened to us without your kindness." She looked up at Samuel with gratitude that went deeper than words could express. Samuel felt something shift inside his chest, a warmth he hadn't experienced since Margaret's death. This tiny life, born in his house under his care, represented hope in a way he'd forgotten was possible. The baby's presence seemed to fill the emptiness that had consumed him for so long. Over the following weeks, the house transformed into a bustling household. Mary proved to be a natural mother, tending to her daughter with a fierce protectiveness that belied her young age. She named the baby Grace, saying she represented God's grace in their darkest hour. Samuel found himself becoming attached to both mother and child. He enjoyed holding Grace during his evening visits, marveling at how something so small could bring such joy. Mary would watch him with the baby, and he could see questions in her eyes, questions about the future, about what would happen as Grace grew older. The town of Cedar Ridge gradually accepted Mary as part of Samuel's household. Some raised eyebrows at the arrangement, but Samuel's reputation as a skilled and compassionate doctor protected them from most gossip. Mrs. Henderson became a frequent visitor, helping with the baby and providing Mary with female companionship. Spring arrived with a burst of wildflowers and the return of traveling merchants to Cedar Ridge. One afternoon, as Samuel was treating a patient with a broken arm, Mary burst into the clinic with tears streaming down her face. She clutched a letter in her trembling hands. "He's coming back," she whispered, her voice filled with terror. "The baby's father. Someone told him about Grace, and he's coming to take her away. Says she's his by right." The letter was formal, written by a lawyer, demanding custody of the child and threatening legal action if Mary refused. Samuel felt a protective fury rise within him. This man had abandoned Mary when she needed him most, leaving her to face poverty and shame alone. Now he wanted to claim the child when it was convenient for him. "He has no right," Samuel said firmly. "He abandoned you both. Any court would see that." But Mary shook her head, her fear palpable. "You don't understand. He has money, influence. I'm just a poor girl with no family. They'll take her away from me, and I'll never see her again." Her voice broke with anguish at the thought of losing her daughter. Samuel made a decision that surprised them both. Then we'll make sure he can't take her, he said quietly. Mary, will you marry me? Not for love, but for protection. As my wife, you'd have legal standing and Grace would be under my protection as well. Mary stared at him in shock. You can't mean that. You barely know me. I'm not asking you to sacrifice your life for us. But even as she protested, Samuel could see hope flickering in her eyes. Marriage would provide legal protection and social respectability for both her and Grace. I'm not sacrificing anything, Samuel replied. You've brought life back to this house, given me purpose beyond just treating patients. I can't promise romantic love, but I can promise loyalty, protection, and a home for you and Grace. He paused, his voice growing softer. Margaret would have wanted this. She always said family wasn't just about blood, but about choosing to care for each other. The wedding took place 3 days later in the small church at the center of Cedar Ridge. Mary wore a simple blue dress that Mrs. Henderson had hastily altered, and Samuel wore his best suit. The ceremony was attended by a handful of townspeople, including the minister's family and several of Samuel's patients. As they exchanged vows, Samuel felt a peace he hadn't experienced since Margaret's death. This wasn't the passionate romance he'd shared with his first wife, but it was something equally valuable, a partnership built on mutual respect and shared purpose. When the baby's father arrived in town 2 weeks later, he found a very different situation than he'd expected. Mary was now Mrs. Morrison, wife of the town's respected doctor, and Grace was legally Samuel's daughter. The man's lawyer quickly realized that any custody battle would be futile and expensive. The confrontation took place in Samuel's clinic, with Mary holding Grace protectively while Samuel stood beside them. The baby's father was a well-dressed man in his 30s, with the kind of polished appearance that came from city living and easy money. You can't hide behind this sham marriage forever, the man snarled, his carefully maintained composure cracking. That's my daughter, and I have rights. I can provide for her better than some frontier doctor. His eyes held a calculating coldness that made Samuel's skin crawl. Samuel stepped forward, his voice steady but firm. You gave up any rights when you abandoned Mary. Grace has a family now, people who've cared for her from birth. Any judge will see that she's better off where she is. He could feel Mary's trembling behind him, but his presence seemed to give her strength. The man's face reddened with anger. This isn't over. I'll be back with better lawyers, more money. You can't keep what's mine. But his threats rang hollow, and after a few more minutes of bluster, he stormed out of the clinic, leaving only the echo of his footsteps on the wooden floor. That evening, as they sat by the fire with Grace sleeping peacefully in her cradle, Mary finally spoke. Do you think he'll really come back? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The fear in her eyes reminded Samuel of the scared girl he'd first met months ago. Samuel considered the question carefully. Probably not. Men like that are bullies who prey on the vulnerable. Now that you're protected, you're no longer an easy target. He'll find some other way to satisfy his ego. He reached over and gently took her hand. You're safe now, Mary. Both of you. As the months passed, their arrangement gradually evolved into something deeper. Samuel and Mary developed a comfortable routine, sharing meals and conversation, working together to care for Grace. Their marriage might have begun as a practical arrangement, but genuine affection was growing between them. Mary proved to be an excellent doctor's assistant, learning to prepare medicines and help with simple procedures. She had a gentle manner with patients and a sharp mind for medical details. Samuel found himself teaching her more advanced techniques, impressed by her quick learning and natural compassion. One evening, as they worked together preparing medicines for the next day's patients, Mary looked up from the herbs she was grinding. Samuel, she said softly, I want you to know how grateful I am, not just for the protection, but for showing me what a real family can be like. Samuel paused in his work, looking at her across the small workspace. In the lamplight, her auburn hair caught golden highlights, and her green eyes held a warmth that made his heart skip. "You've given me more than I've given you," he replied quietly. "You've made this house a home again." Their eyes met and held, and Samuel felt something shift between them. This was no longer just a marriage of convenience. It was becoming something real, something that honored both his love for Margaret and his growing feelings for Mary. Grace took her first steps on a warm spring morning, tottering from Mary's arms to Samuel's with determination that made them both laugh. As Samuel caught the toddler and swung her into the air, he realized that this was his family now, not the one he'd originally planned, but the one that had found him when he needed it most. The little girl had Samuel's brown eyes and Mary's auburn curls, and she called him Papa with the absolute trust that only children possess. Watching her grow and learn filled Samuel with a joy he'd thought lost forever. Grace represented hope and new beginnings in a way that healed old wounds. That summer, Mary told Samuel she was expecting another child. The news filled him with excitement and nervousness. This would be his biological child, but no less precious than Grace. Mary glowed with happiness, her earlier fears replaced by confidence in their secure family life. Dr. Samuel Morrison continued to serve the people of Cedar Ridge, but his practice now had a different quality. Patients noticed his renewed energy and optimism, the way he smiled more readily and spoke with greater warmth. His home visits were often accompanied by Mary, who had become an unofficial nurse and midwife for the community. The story of the rural doctor who lost his wife but found a new family became part of Cedar Ridge's folklore. People spoke of kindness rewarded, of second chances taken, and of how sometimes the greatest healing happens not in the clinic, but in the human heart. Years later, when Samuel was old and grey, he would sit on his porch watching his children play in the garden Margaret had planted. Grace, now a young woman studying to become a teacher, would read to her younger siblings while Mary tended to her flowers. The house was filled with laughter and life, exactly as it should be. Samuel never forgot Margaret or the love they'd shared, but he'd learned that the heart has an infinite capacity for love. His marriage to Mary had begun as an act of protection, but had blossomed into something beautiful and sustaining. They'd both been wounded by life, but together they'd found healing and hope. The frontier was a hard place, full of danger and disappointment, but it was also a place where people could start over, where kindness could triumph over cruelty, and where families could be formed not just by blood, but by choice and commitment. As the sun set over the rolling hills of Cedar Ridge, Samuel reflected on the strange twists of fate that had brought Mary and Grace into his life. What had started as a medical emergency had become the foundation of a new family, proof that sometimes the greatest blessings come disguised as the greatest challenges. Now I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Do you think Samuel made the right choice in offering Mary marriage for protection rather than just friendship? What would you have done in his situation? Share your thoughts about this frontier family's journey and let me know what other Old West stories you'd like to hear.